On this episode of the show, I have with me Luke Fisher. He is co-founder and CEO at SkyFi. And we're going to be talking about, well, he's had a career that is dealt with a lot in the air. We're going to ask him about that. He was in special ops. He was head of air ops at Uber, and he's now launched SkyFi. And we're going to ask him all about entering the domain of the government, talking about some of the unlocks that he's seeing out in the market, a little bit of geospatial data and privacy components in there. Try to ask as many questions as I can, but Luke, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, super pumped to be here. Super excited to talk about all the things, whether it's satellites, helicopters, Uber, you name it. So yeah, ready to dig in.
Love it. All right, before we start, could you tell everyone what you guys do at SkyFi?
Yeah, so SkyFi, we're an Earth intelligence platform company. And what that means is we deliver geospatial imagery and analytics to global customers, commercial customers, governments, U.S. government, allied governments all over the world. And when I say deliver geospatial technology, I mean give our customers the ability to task satellites in the future from our largest or the largest virtual constellation of assets in the world that we have. Get that historical imagery going back days, weeks, months, even decades. And then more importantly, applying analytics or asking questions of the data to get answers. Things like vessel detection, oil levels, moisture content of soil, troop movements, you name it. And for the first time ever, I think we're at this inflection point where you can really query the Earth. You can ask questions of the Earth from the technology that we have.
That's cool. Yeah, tons of when I was looking at this episode on the list, I was like, this one is all about things that are potentially happening now and things that we haven't even thought about. So I'm excited. I guess we'll rewind a little bit. I did mention in your background you have spent a career in the military, and thank you for your service. And from there, obviously, you have gone into various other businesses, but to connect the story, I guess if you could tell us a little bit about that, what you did when you were serving, and we'll kind of link that to the next step in the career.
Yeah. And so I spent a total of 20 years in the Army, 16 years of that active duty, most of that on the special operations side. And then I finished out 4 years as a reservist at Defense Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley under the autonomy portfolio. So really interesting, 20 years of service. I was an aviator by trade. And then important too is, 9/11 happened my senior year of college. And prior to that, there's always stuff going on, but typically you do ROTC, you get commissioned from one of the academies, you go and serve and you go do something else. Well, we jumped right into the war. So you got trained as a Kiowa Warrior pilot, which is a reconnaissance attack helicopter. And note that aircraft is now in the museum. It's no longer being flown by the U.S., so it dates me a little bit. But I did a total of, I think, 13 combat deployments, a couple of those year-long deployments to Iraq, so very, very familiar with that landscape. And yeah, right into every definition of war, where you're, in a gunfight every day, as a recon attack pilot, we were literally feet overhead of buildings, protecting the ground troops, responding to various firefights across the various locations that we're at, reconning for everything you can imagine, whether it was, RPG firing positions, mortar positions, people setting up suicide bombs and, looking for vehicles that were suspicious or animals that had wires coming out of them, for IDs. It was just stuff I would never have thought of doing. For all of that, then, I went to the special operations side. That continued as an aviator, got a bunch more deployments all over the Middle East. Super interesting, super fun. The big difference, a lot shorter deployments as opposed to the multi-year long deployments that, that I experienced before in the regular Army. And then, it was my time to think of something different. You get spoiled in the special ops community because it's amazing and it's fun. You work with the best people in the world, all want to be there, all tried out to be there. And then at some point, everyone has to leave, whether it's for a career progression thing or, life choice. Mine was a little bit of both. And so that's when I got out, joined DIU as an Army reservist to finish out that 20 years of service. But then I joined Uber. I was head of flight operations for Uber.
Absolutely. On a side note, I've had the luxury of interviewing a few ex-service members that have served in Iraq or similar. And when you guys talk about it, guys, just general, non gender specific, when you talk about it, you talk about it so casually as, we're taking fire. Most people just have never been in life and death situations. And what's interesting is, in speaking to the guests, is I've learned that there are so many constructs within service. They mentioned, the ODA loops, the observe, orient, detect, decide, act. And we're talking about that and talking about how that translates into, once you get out and you're looking for that first job and some of those intangibles, there are so many things in there that, having to make decisions that are a lot of one-way doors that in the business world that you don't get a chance to reflect on. And it's interesting because you all are so modest about it, but then, having heard a couple of these conversations of, and I'm like, I'm not sure how I'd react. And I guess side question, we'll get back to the topic at hand. But when you look at your background in the military and you look at yourself in now, being a co-founder of a startup, some of those intangibles, can you maybe just highlight some of those? Because I think it's great for people to hear so that when they do see a veteran's resume, that they can put some perspective to some of these terms that might not be familiar otherwise.
Yeah. And I'm pretty critical on veteran resumes, and I post about it on LinkedIn quite a bit with tips because I fell in the same trap. I had the awesome opportunity to go to business school where I got a really good crash course in a resume and how to storytell and all stuff. But I think a lot of veterans specifically get lost in what the military transition programs tell them, like translate your job into a civilian equivalent. And the biggest one I pick on a lot is you'll have a platoon leader or a company commander or a sergeant major try to get an equivalent job title. It'll be like company commander / executive director, or the worst one is for me is like battalion commander / CEO. I go, you're not a CEO equivalent. It would just be like a CEO going CEO / battalion commander equivalent. Like they're apples to elephants on that side. So translating skills, but it's really about telling a condensed story in one page about you led people, you were responsible for conducting missions, you take direction very well, you can provide guidance and leadership. That is the main thing that gets I think veterans a really good heads up in the job market. But overall, the biggest thing is the network. A lot of veterans get jobs. That's how I was at Uber. My buddy Stan, who I flew with back in the day, got out before me and landed at Uber, and so I got it through the network. But also with veterans and like startups and going to commercial side, where I think specifically with startups, I equate it to very similar to special operations, where special operations soldiers are selected to solve these undefined, very complex and complicated problems. And they're like, you select the right people, right trace-based selection, go solve this problem. Startups are the same thing. We're like, you're finding the right people with the right traits to solve these undefined problems and being comfortable with risk. Where, I know people that are, get out of the military, they're like uncomfortable with accepting risk for whatever their job was. And they're like, I'm going to go to a Boeing or a Northrop or a Lockheed where it's safe and, no real change in the day-to-day pace. Whereas a startup is the exact opposite, just like special operations is the exact opposite, where it's like chaos every day, but you have to have the right people. And some people, I'd say most people should not join startups. It is a not very logical, thing to do. High probability of failure, crazy stress, often low pay. But that's on the military too. You're doing that. Most people shouldn't be in special operations. And we found out through special operations too, and I think it equates to startups very, very well, is the IQ. You have to be smart enough to do the job on both sides, but also just dumb enough to be like, I'm just going to go do the thing. I'm not going to overthink it. Because both sides are, I've seen both sides on special operations were not smart enough to do the job. And also the ones that are so smart, overthink and overanalyze, and you can plan all day, where at some point it's like, but get moving, go do the thing. So yeah, whole bunch of like tangential, like carry over to both sides of that equation.
I love that. That's actually fantastic. That's a fantastic observation. Obviously you referred to and mentioned going to Uber, and we'll kind of, obviously highlight that in a second. But you stopped at Uber, and you've had some of that experience now with leveraging your work you did in the military. I guess if we were to jump forward a little bit and look at what you guys do now, I get we're dealing with satellites and data from satellites, but from the actual aviation component to satellites, there's a bit of a leap in terms of how you saw that opportunity and what you saw transforming that kind of made you go even further higher up into the atmosphere.
Well, I owe a lot to my co-founder, Bill Perkins. So, when he and I met, he was, already taken a bunch of steps. He wanted to start SkyFi because he was, coming from the hedge fund world and still is with oil and natural gas trading. And he's going around trying to buy all this imagery from all the satellite companies. And it was this crazy, painful process. We're trying to give a satellite company $1 million and be like, give me imagery as soon as possible. They'd be like, well, how much are you going to buy next year? And we need to talk for 6 months and let's do a bunch of dinners. He's like, I'm trying to give you $1 million. I want imagery as fast as possible. Could not be done. Like, it was literally the most painful thing. So he and I met when I was thinking actually a little bit lower altitude, because I was in this autonomous vehicle world of going, hey, if you believe in autonomous vehicles, they collect large amounts of data as a byproduct of having to operate in these environments. So partner with them, sell their data. Bill, incredibly, successful, formulated this. So it was like, let's do this idea. We just met through the Uber network. A friend of mine was meeting Bill, and the day after Thanksgiving, I was eating leftover Thanksgiving at Bill's place here in Austin, and we formed up and started SkyFi, incorporated, and then really January of 2022 is when we started, and off to the races of this insight. And I coming from a national security side, I mean, there's really one space market. It's the U.S. government. They're the largest purchaser. They are why every company exists in this industry right now, and largely also because of Elon Musk, where we're able to get satellites in space and the technology down. So we owe a lot to that. But national security side house is where my expertise is. I know the people, know the processes, and then we hired a great team, or I hired a great team to execute and build well. And we actually didn't hire from the geospatial industry purposefully because we wanted a different approach. CTO of SkyFi is Julian, and before him was this guy Cross, and both of them were at Uber, for years and years and years. And so this core group of ex-Uber engineers just through the network that understood product and scalability. And we rely on the satellite companies, hey, put the metal in space, but we understand scale and product and customer demand and feedback and acting on it. So it's a really good recipe of success from my background, Bill's background, fundraising at the right time in 2022, and then building a team very quickly to execute. But yeah, I like from the higher side, I was a consumer of this technology on the military side where my process, and it still exists to this day, that's why we're getting a lot of government work, is as an aviator, I'd be like, we want to land at X location. We'd plan these missions, and then would go through this bureaucratic chain of intel analysts, collection managers, up to another collection manager who are prioritizing these assets over time and space on Excel spreadsheets where it doesn't scale. It can take hours and days and weeks to get imagery. And so you're just at this point where you're like, but now with the technology that we built at SkyFi, my teenage daughters can task a satellite, but soldiers on the battlefield cannot, and that's a problem. And so that's why we're fixing that.
Yeah, you mentioned. I've noticed now a couple of times you've mentioned networking, and the Uber job obviously networked back into Uber, used a little military net. I love that because I think sometimes when people look at someone's career, they look at all the things on the LinkedIn, on the resume, and they go, oh, look at that. And then you look at all the little pieces of hustle, not even hustle, but intuition, desire to go, I can leverage the other things and those connections. And obviously you mentioned the military, the Uber circle, and you reference people, especially ex-service members, probably don't do that enough and should do that more. But it's just an interesting call out because I think I don't see that as often mentioned as, hey, I reached out and this person, timing, lineman, all that stuff. So and that's what at business school, I think the most important class I
took that's not actually a class, you don't get graded on it, is building a network. Because no one cares about the grades. Like when I hire people, I don't care about what grade you got in high school or college, or even if I was like, can you do the job? But more importantly, it's that network. And I had folks I went to business school with that were like, I don't care about all the social stuff or networking. I want to get the best grades and learn the thing. And then here they are now. No one knows who they are. Very hard to build a network from scratch, realizing that. And I think that's just resounding over and over and over again in all these lessons I've learned. It's all about the network. Because like, let's say Andrel opens up a role. How many hundreds, maybe thousands of people are going to apply for that role? So how do you stick out? You have to know the person that knows the person that's the hiring manager and be like, hey, my buddy, Kate or Jeff or Tom is going to apply. That's it. But people don't realize it's how it works. And then the people on the outside that don't have the networks complain about it. Because they're like, oh, it's the good old boy system working. No, it's not. It's just humans talking to humans. And that's how we get jobs. And that's how you validate and get block checked as a relevant person that can do a job. So yeah, I'm big on networks.
Love it. I guess, a lot of people that I have on the show don't have as much government work. I'd say a lot of consumer, a lot of B2B, but when it comes to the government side, obviously you mentioned, they're obviously a large entity, the largest in the space. When you do enter a domain where the government is one of the larger players, and maybe from a startup perspective, maybe just from a founder perspective, what changes? What do you need to start thinking about and focusing on, knowing that the U.S. government is the largest thing that exists on Earth?
Yeah, I think it goes back. First thing is the network. Like it is still very much a people game. Like you have to know what the users are experiencing, what their pain points are. Are they going to use your technology and actually get value out of it? That is the one thing. And then understanding the government acquisition process. Everybody complains about it. I complain about it. It's too slow. It's too complex. It's only designed for the defense primes to win. And we're seeing a lot of that change in this new Trump administration, but it's still this big, gigantic animal that is very hard to break into unless you know the people, unless you know the process, and also to have the patience. At SkyFi, we took a commercial first approach. I would say, of course, hindsight's 2020. We're going to go where the money is, but we went commercial first. Then realized, as we got a bunch of commercial feedback and reps under our belt, and dealing with a bunch of customers, then the government called us and said, "Hey, we heard about you. We'd like to do a demo," and that's why we got a contract with the Space Force. But it allowed us to mature the product in a faster iteration cycle than what we saw in other companies we're competing with who were only defense. Because when you go only defense, you might have one contract, which means you have one customer, which means you're going to get feedback very, very infrequently. And that's just harder to adapt, where it's also on the culture side, where we built a culture of speed and iteration, product and customer focus commercially, which carries directly over to the government. And I'll say it's from experience. I think I'm relevant enough to say this. It is much easier to start commercial and go government than it is to go government and then commercial, just based on the people you hire. Because it is, again, apples to elephants to orange juice, talking about how to sell to all these entities and the values there. But yeah, it's fun. And what's awesome too is it dates me a little bit. All my buddies I served with are all now general officers or soon to be general officers and decision makers here. So it's not like they're using it to advantage. It's back to that network thing, where they trust me. It's a big thing.
Absolutely. I guess, the product itself, obviously we're talking about, Earth intelligence data. Obviously the use cases, you kind of alluded to a few, how the company originated. And I guess maybe to clarify, because maybe somebody who's listening or watching is like, oh, I see this in the movie. We need Earth data, and you see it on the camera. They quickly clack, they pick it up, and they go, oh, we can spot the horseshoe on the ground. That's what we need to go find. When we talk about an Earth intelligence platform, obviously finding things makes sense, but what are some of the use cases that we probably don't think about when we're not within the industry of needing to use that level of imagery and geospatial analytics?
Good question. So, and for those listening and watching too, the actual product itself is a web and mobile application. So you can go to app.skyfi.com, on the web or on iOS or on Android. Download this, sign up, push a couple buttons, task a satellite, get these analytics, which are the answers, which I'll talk about, to just some of the most, valuable information in the earth that it has for the first time. You're now able to access it because the access was a problem. It just like most defense technology, once it spins out to the commercial world is where we're at in these last couple of years. The innovation increases and the use cases increase and the value increases, so you create it more. So use cases just off the bat for us. You can track vessels. You can get building counts. You can do wildfire analysis. You can detect certain minerals from space at massive scale, and it's all varying pricing based on the technology. There is some of the fun ones I like to point out. Not that it's massive revenue generators, but maybe it is. Agriculture companies use us. One of the fun ones I like to think of is they look at huge livestock areas for cows to see which cows are standing, which are laying down, to know if the feed they're providing to these farmers is getting used well. Because if the cows are laying down, it means they're tired, it means they're not being fed as much. So they go, hey, farmers, feed them more. Counting barges up and down the Mississippi for agriculture and produce shipping. Looking at palm tree heights in Indonesia to judge palm oil production. Looking at wheat fields for agricultural yields. And then, things like, with the technology we've got, some proprietary analytics, looking at, you can detect Russian camouflage. You can look at Chinese PLA helmets. You can determine where a vessel was painted based on the signature of the paint, because it's all very unique on what port it was. So maybe it's a, French flagged, oil carrier, but maybe it's actually from an Iranian port. They're, false flagging it. So on and on and on. And then some crazy fun ones once in a while where, people proposing to their fiancés. We timed one over Rockefeller Center one day at 10:19 a.m. and the clouds worked out and this guy proposed to his girlfriend and, getting married, and we have that shot for him. It's something that you remember forever. Not that that's a big market for us at all, but it's fun. So everything from, very, very clear defense to super interesting, fun stuff like that.
I like that. I mean, that's amazing, because you brought up some use cases that I think just most of us would not even think that type of data would be leveraged for. I guess when you look at the data, you look at the accessibility. It's global. There's implications. When we start looking at that and we start thinking about just the privacy side of having access to that data, and the fact that it is, I don't know if we can say the word democratized, but maybe regular people have access. I mean, it is democratized. It was something that we couldn't have before. I guess that'll be fair. But when you look at that privacy side, I guess what are some components within the solution, and maybe just general concerns when you're building something like this where it is at such a global scale?
Yeah, one of the biggest concerns that that we put a lot of money to, a lot of resources to, and humans to, is who can acquire this data and imagery. Because we are a U.S. entity, and so we do diligence checks on everyone that purchases. Because if you're on a sanction list and from Department of Treasury, Commerce, you name it, we do not sell to those individuals. So if you're a Venezuelan sanctioned individual or entity, you're not going to get access to us. Russia, China, you name it, we constantly screen this. And our process is so good, that some of our partner companies that we work with have adapted our process. Because, the one thing is, we can't sell to folks that that we can't sell to by U.S. law. So we obviously abide by that. The other one is we do that so other companies do not have to do it on our behalf. So typically in this industry, which is still amazes me, almost all of our competitors either sell or give up their customer names to the satellite companies. I won't call those companies out. There's only a few of them, which amazes me. And it comes from a lot of laziness in the procedure, and then not understanding the business practice of when somebody buys through SkyFi, that's a SkyFi customer. It's not a X satellite or X analytic, company. It is ours. So I keep that customer data, and also we keep it very locked down. For the most part, I don't even have access to who our customers are, nor should I. So that's a very interesting part when it comes to privacy of what you can collect. Space is still the wild, wild west. It is, one of the first pictures I took in February of 2022 when we were testing out everything. was in Western Russia, watching brigades of Russian troops mass on the Ukrainian border. I just took it myself. I heard about it like somewhere in the OSINT world. I was like, there's a location, they're massing. I looked at historical imagery and they got a new one. Sure enough, no tanks or vehicles one day. Next day, everyone moved in. It was snow, so you could see that, that traction. So I didn't need anyone to tell me what was going on. But, for individuals, you could take a picture anywhere in the world right now. And that's just the fact. And that is not going to decrease. That is only going to increase. With the latency is getting reduced, the resolution is getting so much better, but we're not at the, like you mentioned, like the James Bond level where you're like, oh, there's the horseshoe on the ground, or reading the license plates, not commercially anyways. But it's all just, evolution of the technology that's going to continue to get faster and better and cheaper, which I think is good for the world. Some people are like, oh, what about privacy? I go, privacy is always a concern. We'll always do, best effort to protect against that. Who needs the data and who should get the data? But also look at the good for the earth. Like, for the first time, I'm a big believer. If you can see what is going on in the earth, it brings true visibility to make decisions. If you can see what happens when you have, an earthquake or some sort of natural disaster or war, like to really visualize that and see it without what I'd say is a typical filtered lens by the media where it's all about a story and eyeball and clicks. This is like, imagery is great. It'll always tell a story. That is very clear. Then you have the answers that go along with it.
I actually, it's funny is when I talk about privacy and just data with people, I'm like, I don't have a whole lot to hide. Like, seeing my imagery somewhere, would that really mean anything? Probably not. But also when we look at capabilities that we could unlock, and you just referenced a couple of, the palm trees. I hadn't really thought about, okay, wow, we can actually potentially start observing palm oil production. I mean, these are little things that we didn't have capabilities before that will ripple into the supply chain of different industries that didn't have data, that were guessing, that could increase costs, that could introduce volatility. And it's not at onesie twosie scale. I mean, we're talking, if you're using this data, it's probably in the billions and billions of dollars scale. It's not data you need for a $100,000 decision. I mean, you might be able to leverage it for that, but we're talking about bigger products, bigger scale. When you kind of look at the capabilities, if obviously if you're putting your crystal ball, and obviously we have just a growth in interest in space, where does the product kind of go? Obviously, right now you mentioned kind of where you're servicing, but also on the flip side, you alluded to we don't have that detail yet on the commercial side. So obviously, we know maybe that exists somewhere, there's maybe not access to us. But what can we do more? What will we see happen as the technology matures? What are those capabilities that you're excited about?
What I'm very excited about is, people to use geospatial technology without even knowing they're getting imagery from a satellite or looking back historically at, stratospheric balloon data or whatever it is. And I'd be remiss to say, if I didn't mention, the impact of AI, where I'm very big fan. It's obviously here to stay. It's obviously a very, very real thing that we're all working with right now. But where the product goes is just getting answers. Where I want people to come in, and what we're building, both government and commercial, I think better than anyone, because we have this huge data source of customers and satellites of every different type of phenomenology and sensor type. Where I want a customer to go like, show me what's going on in the South China Sea over the last week at the St. Thomas Shoal, and you get an answer. Maybe you get imagery with that, or maybe you get a report. So we're integrating these various models from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Grok, and Gemini, pairing it with our big data source and going, give people the answer. That's what it's really about, because the decision makers in companies are often not the people you're selling to. You're sometimes selling to like the geospatial analyst, where they in turn take your data and then brief it up to their boss or their manager, be like, here's the thing. And the manager goes, yes or no. Like, we should skip all that and just go like, give the people the information they need to make the decision themselves. So it's more about what I think contextual input and then integrating more data sources, because geospatial is a piece of the puzzle. Like, hedge funds use us for a piece of their puzzle, then they're using that, social media data and credit card data and, AIS data from ships, like all this stuff. And then they go, let's make a decision. So where we go is what I want to do is, very quickly semantic inputs to go, tell me about X, you get information about X, you make a decision. But then more importantly, that's the step for it. Because we gather all this information, the next step is without even you have to do that step first. After you serve or get those questions delivered to the customers, then the next step is proactively serving those customers the questions based on their historical profile and everything. It's kind of like, almost like Google search, like where you're going to go browse around and look at stuff, or more like Amazon checkout, like, hey, other customers like you also did this. Would you like to add this to your cart? That's the same thing we're going. But why does SkyFi get to do that? Because we're uniquely positioned, because we have all the data types. We've got all the customers, government and commercial, where most companies deal with a very niche, X amount of satellites, very certain capability, where we've got it all. And I don't think most people realize that, which is great for us.
It's really cool. It'll be interesting. I mean, maybe we'll have to revisit, down the road and see capabilities. I was going to ask you before I let you go about another business you own. I obviously we hadn't prepped about talking about this, but this is a little bit more selfish to my own interest. You are a founder of another company that does something also vital in a different way for a lot of us caffeine addicts. And it is something you give back. So I just wanted, if you could for a second, tell us a little bit about Sky Roasters, because I thought it's really cool.
Yeah. So 99% of it is my wife. So, it's a business we started together when COVID was kicking off. I'm going we both love coffee, got into it. So she runs skyroasters.com. It's, she's a female roaster. You've got these great beans from Guatemala over years and years of research. You can buy it online. And I think it's some of the best beans out there, and she's, almost at capacity right now because it's her, and she's got a couple folks that help her, but, looking to scale up. But the big piece of that too is what we do is, big portion of the proceeds we donate back to the special operations community, because that's where we got our start. That's why I'm here. That's why we're able to have this life, is because of that. And, we owe a lot to that community. It's a small way to give back. And also selfishly, we drink a lot of coffee, and it's amazing to have literally thousands of pounds of coffee at your disposal and be able to roast it yourself. But it's all her. 99% of that's her and the business and what she runs and how she roasts it. And that's good. But I encourage everyone to check it out, skyroasters.com. She got started before skyfi.com.
How did you know I was going to ask about that? Because I was like, that's a darn good name, and your company is called SkyFi. So, all right. Well, really cool mission. I like the fact that's giving back. And look, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing. If somebody does have a follow-up, if somebody wants to learn more, what are some good ways of connecting?
Yeah, multiple ways on socials. For me on LinkedIn, I'm all over LinkedIn, but our SkyFi Brands account on X, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Email us at info@skyfi.com, or go to the app.skyfi.com on web or mobile, iOS or Android. And we're happy to talk to every customer out there.
Absolutely. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I love this episode. I mean, you have a guy that built his career in the military, leveraged his network, his connections, stayed within the lane that he was operating and found actually a higher level to operate, pun intended. And we also learned that he's giving back through his the startup that his wife runs, obviously Sky Roasters, which I think you guys should check that out as well. It's really cool that he's giving back to that community. But please share this episode with somebody else who might also like it and will benefit from it. It's a great story, and we're super excited to see what SkyFi will do next. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.